Hello and welcome to the fast tutorial on how the UVs work in Maya. I'm working on 2018, but it should be the same for 2019 and 2020. So when you create something that is a polygon plane, in this case I'll just go in and grab the default 1, 1, 10, 10 polygon plane, you've got a whole bunch of geometry here to work with, and I'll turn on shading, wireframe on shaded, so we can see it even when I don't have it selected. And right now this tracks pretty much exactly to what you'll see in the UV editor as well. Come up to UV, bring up the UV editor. So you've got the toolkit here. We'll ignore this for just a second. And when you split things in Maya, UVs, what you want to do is grab the edges that you want to cut. You can't cut UVs. You can move UVs, but you have to cut edges. So make sure that first of all you're aware that Maya has this rule of you can manipulate UVs, but you actually cannot manipulate them in the form of cutting or sewing them together. So I'm going to methodically choose by shift left clicking each of these edges and coming up here to cut sew, and then instead of cut, I don't want to use cut, I actually want to use split, because that immediately splits these edges. So the first thing you'll notice whenever you go into these operations of splitting and sewing is that it's really hard to figure out where Maya has actually cut the edges. What I have on is this little icon here, which is to outline the borders of anything that I've cut. So it gives a slightly thicker line here, which really helps when you're trying to figure out if you've cut something correctly or not. And the other way to do it is to right click and hold down in the UV editor the options and go to UV shell, because UV shell will actually show the different sort of complete islands that you've cut away from each other. In this case, I had one island, which was this entire thing when you started out, but since I've successfully cut it, what I can do here is I can select the left part and the right part separately. They're separate UV shells. However, in Maya's mind, while these faces and this object is one big Maya file, these have not been separated. I did not separate the geometry. All I did was separate the UVs. So be careful with what you think you're seeing here, because the geometry has not been manipulated, just the instructions on how you want to texture this object. So if I right click and go back to UV shell, I can select this separate shell and actually move it out. And another trick I can use if I desire is I can grab the UVs, and even with just 4 UVs selected there, you can see them, they're little green corners, I can press the shift greater than key and it will grow to encompass the whole of this UV shell. So that's one way you can actually grab the UV shell, by going into UV shell mode. You can also grab the UVs and just grow them until they finally truncate or finally encompass everything that you're looking to select. Another way of doing this is double clicking the edge, because it'll run the whole length of that edge, be it vertical or horizontal. So you can go again into cut and sew. Remember, we don't want to use cut, actually want to use split. And with the border on, you can see it slightly thicken as a line once I'm done with this operation. So have a look at this salmon colored line behind me here, because it's going to thicken ever so slightly once I go through this successfully. Pop, and there it is. And then I come into UV shell and I can grab this and move it up. So that's a pretty nice fast way of doing things, but remember, if you just want to left click and hold down your shift key, you can actually choose a lot more complex patterns as long as there's an edge there to warrant the slicing off. So if I were to then split this, I now have a much more unique shape for this particular UV shell. And again, every time I move this off the what I call surgery table, it's not manipulating the geometry. It's just manipulating Maya's understanding of how to texture map these. So if I take a unique piece like this, I can translate. I can also hold down the X key and snap it to the grid if I want to. I can also rotate, but the problem with rotation is it's arbitrary. I really have no idea what degree I'm rotating, and sometimes I want to straighten things out, but it's really something I'm just kind of, doing guesswork. And if you want things like scaling, you can do that as well. But remember that you're kind of changing the UVs in a way that you might want to repair later. So the basic idea between the cutting and sewing is that if you want to sew these edges back together, remember in Maya's mind, they're kind of the same edge. I mean, they're different UV edges, but if you look here in the model, it actually is the same edge because, again, the geometry is not being changed. So what we see as two edges here that are separate is actually the same edge in Maya's mind. So when I select one, it invariably selects the other because it is, again, the same edge. So if I wanted to bring these together, sew them, I would come up to Cut and Sew and go down instead. Now it seems like I want sew, but look what happens when I do. It chooses the average space between those edges and just kind of slams them together, which is actually what I asked it to do, to the letter. What I really want to do is I want this piece to be moved over here and then sew that edge up. So even though I've grabbed just one edge and it grabs the other one, I can come up here to Cut, Sew, and go to Move and Sew. Watch what happens. It actually brings the smaller piece over and sews that edge. What about these other larger bold edges? Were they not sewn together? Well, no, because I didn't select them. So if I go in a little closer and just sort of select them by hand, because remember I did the selection by hand just to cut them, I now have to select the very same ones I want sewn together. And because they're right on top of each other, I could try the sew because they are right on top of each other. There's no moving involved to find the average space between those edges. I could do that. I'm going to press undo here and do another method where it's also move and sew. Both are equally fine when they're on top of each other. Another way I could have done that is to actually come in here when they were separate and try to grab the edge all the edges that I want sewn together. So I'm going methodically down this and grabbing all of the edges I want sewn together, and then I can go to Cut, Sew, Move and Sew, and it does everything at once. I see I missed one down here because of that bold outline, and because it's right where it should be, I can choose either Merge or Move and Sew. Sorry, not Merge, but Sew or Move and Sew. Either or. Either are fine. Now for the UV shell, if you want to have a rotation that's exacting, you can come down here to the UV toolkit and you can click on Transform, and you have a rotation down here under Tools, which allows you these two buttons that will rotate it at this degree, which is changeable. So this is where you can determine the actual rotation of your UV sets if you desire, be it a selection of UVs that you've done by hand, or in this case the entire UV shell. All of these commands actually correspond to commands you can find up here, but frankly there are very long lists of drop-down menus, and just trying to find what you want can be sort of tedious. That's why I like to use the UV toolkit here. So with this grabbed, I can rotate it 90 degrees, or I can change this to 45 and rotate it back. So what's going to happen here if I try to sew these edges since they no longer align? This edge here is actually corresponding to this edge on the top. Well, it doesn't matter because luckily the move and sew that I showed earlier also accounts for rotation, not just translation, but rotation. So look what it does here. It takes the smaller piece and orients it to the bigger piece. So that's a nice little bit of help that Maya gives you. And I'm going to Shift, Select, and then Shift Unselect things to grab, to try and grab all of the edges that I want to sew back together that I missed. And there we are. So with this method, it's pretty nice. It's pretty easy to align things. And another method you can use to align things is if you've grabbed your UV sets and moved them up, moved them over, and they're all kind of wonky now, and you want to line them all up. They're all crazy. Maya has a way of grabbing these UV sets, and from your selection, Maya gives you the option of aligning them so that you can actually try to straighten them out a bit. So where that is called Align and Snap down here. And if you scroll to the bottom, once you open that up, you've got these icons. These 6 icons will, with their setup, show you which one which UV set it's going to align the rest to. So that white line basically determines it's going to snap to the lowermost UV. So it's going to take these two UVs here I have selected and snap them down to the lowest one. And the icon, of course, for the opposite would be this one snapping to the top, like so. And I don't want that, so I'm going to just undo here. And then I'm going to snap them all to the bottom, and it should take this UV and that UV and align it right along this line with this one. All right. Another thing I could do is just, because it's on the grid, I could grid snap it by holding down X and snapping it by just dragging that axis. That's all I want to do right now. This is trickier to align it along this edge because this edge does not actually lie on an axis. So what I do in this case is grab the thing I want to move and then something I can use as a measuring tool to align this furthest UV, which I've selected on the right, to align with the leftmost one here. And for that, I'm going to choose this icon, click, and it works great. The last bit here is to just grab an edge, and again we sew edges, we split edges, so in this case I'm just grabbing this edge, but let's say I want to grab the whole of it, this entire line. Well, Maya, as a last little trick, does allow you to, as we know, if you double click an edge it goes all the way around. We actually don't want that because that's going to get pretty crazy if we do that. Well, in this case that's exactly what we want, but let's just say that if you were to merge them together or sew them together, things can get crazy because again it's choosing the average space. But if you want to select just this edge here, you can select the first edge, hold down the shift and double click, and it will only grab the edges between these two selections. So that's exactly what we want. And now we go up to cut and sew and go to move and sew. Boom, there you go. All right, I hope that helps with the understanding of how to manipulate UVs in Maya. Please see the TA if you have any questions.